Drew Barrymore arrived at the Ed Sullivan Theater that evening in high spirits, her usual charm lighting up the backstage corridor as she waved and cracked jokes with the crew, clearly anticipating a warm conversation with Stephen Colbert, someone she had previously considered both witty and welcoming. But underneath her glowing persona was a quiet determination to set the record. Straight on a recent controversy that had dragged her name into the political spotlight following her comments about mental health, creative boundaries, and the exploitation of artists in the age of streaming. And as she settled into her chair opposite Colbert, the first few minutes were filled with laughter and nostalgic anecdotes about her childhood in Hollywood. But it didn't take long for the tone to shift. When Colbert, perhaps pushed by producers looking to capitalize on viral tension, subtly prodded her about her decision to resume filming her talk show during the Writers Guild strike. A move that had drawn sharp criticism from many in the entertainment industry. And while Drew had addressed the issue previously with calm and care, that night on live television, she felt cornered, the applause light flickering just off stage as Colbert's questions became more pointed. Veiled behind his usual smirking delivery, but unmistakably barbed as he quoted striking writers who had publicly condemned her actions. And in response, Drew's posture changed. Still smiling, but clearly steeling herself, she pushed back with passion, explaining how difficult it had been to navigate responsibility to her crew, her audience, and her personal values during a turbulent industry standoff, asserting that she had never intended to undermine solidarity, but it also felt the crushing guilt of hundreds of livelihoods depending on her decision. And Colbert, instead of acknowledging her nuance, interrupted with a sarcastic comment about Hollywood martyrs, which landed poorly with both the studio audience and Drew, who visibly tensed before replying, her voice firmer than it had been all night, that being born into fame did not mean she lacked empathy or sacrifice, and that perhaps if others had shouldered the same scrutiny from childhood, they might understand how exhausting it was to constantly be everyone's symbol for either progress or betrayal. And for a moment, the audience didn't know whether to clap or hold their breath, the tension thicker than any late-night banter could conceal. And when Colbert chuckled awkwardly and tried to pivot back to lighter ground, Drew didn't follow. Instead, continuing to articulate the double standard she felt women, especially women in the public eye, were held to when they made decisions during crisis moments, comparing the support some male hosts received for returning to work early to the vitriol she had faced.
Ow.
And though Colbert tried to regain control of the segment, Drew's calm but cutting tone held the space firmly, forcing even the crew to go quiet. And what happened next would become the clip seen by millions the following morning, Stephen leaning back in his chair with a performative shrug and joking, "Well, maybe next time just don't cross the picket line," to which Drew, maintaining eye contact, replied, "Maybe next time, don't mistake loyalty to your writers as an excuse to attack your guests." And the silence that followed was deafening. Even the band unsure whether to cue the outro music, and after a few seconds of Drew glancing off stage toward the producers, she stood up, not angrily, not dramatically, but with the kind of deliberate composure that only someone who'd been through decades of Hollywood firestorms could muster, and simply said, "I think I'm done here," before walking off stage, leaving Colbert visibly rattled and scrambling to transition into the next segment as the audience clapped hesitantly, unsure whether to interpret her departure as justified defiance or diva behavior. But by the following morning, the headlines had already taken sides, with some framing Drew's walk-off as a meltdown while others hailed it as a stand for dignity, especially as a new generation of fans took to TikTok and Instagram praising her poise and dragging Colbert for pushing too hard under the guise of satire. And behind the scenes, the late-night host reportedly called Drew personally to apologize, admitting he may have crossed a line in trying to press for drama. Though sources close to Barrymore claim she remained polite but distant during the conversation, unwilling to play into the cycle of public forgiveness performatively expected of female celebrities after emotional moments. And while Colbert's show continued as normal, viewers noted a noticeably softer tone in the weeks that followed when interviewing other guests who had dealt with controversy, so Drew's exit had served as a warning about mistaking entertainment for empathy. And meanwhile, Drew returned to her own platform with grace, addressing the incident only once in a brief monologue, where she said, "Sometimes when you know your truth, you don't need to stay and fight to prove it, you just walk away," which drew thunderous applause and a wave of social media support, even from previously critical voices who now saw her in a new light. Not as a perfect public figure, but as someone willing to take heat without losing her humanity, and by years' end, the Barrymore-Colbert incident had become a cultural footnote, studied by pundits and professors alike for what it revealed about gender dynamics in media, the blurry line between authenticity and performance, and the emotional toll of being asked to defend your morality in front of millions under the glow of studio lights. And though Drew and Stephen would never share a stage again, their clash remained a defining moment in talk show history, a cautionary tale for future hosts and guests alike about the dangers of pushing too far when the cameras are still rolling and the truth, no matter how inconvenient, refuses to be cut for time. In the weeks following that fateful night when Drew Barrymore abruptly walked off the set, the media landscape underwent a transformation as the incident became not only a headline, but a cultural touchstone that reverberated through every corner of public discourse. And while industry insiders scrambled to mitigate the fallout by re-editing segments and issuing careful statements, Drew herself retreated into a reflective silence that became the subject of murmured admiration. Among those who had long grown weary of toxic public spectacles, her sudden exit, charged with raw emotion and undeniable authenticity, compelled an outpouring of support from audiences who saw in it the embodiment of a courageous refusal to be compromised by a system that prizes sensationalism over substance. And as the uproar echoed on social media with hashtags and memes proliferating to immortalize the moment, Drew began to reframe her narrative on her own terms by hosting private salons with independent journalists, activists, and artists in intimate settings far from the glare of national broadcast cameras, where she discussed not only her own journey and the weight of constant scrutiny, but also the deep-seated issues of gender, power, and the relentless pressure on women in the entertainment industry to conform to sanitized, market-friendly personas. And from these gatherings emerged a series of candid, unscripted interviews that were later compiled into a self-produced digital series titled Unfiltered Conversations, a project intended not as a public relations maneuver, but as an authentic exploration of the complexities of being a woman in a media landscape where vulnerability is often weaponized against you. In this series, Drew invited former colleagues, unsung heroes from nonprofit organizations, and even critics who had once derided her on air, encouraging them to share their hidden stories of defiance and resilience. And through this initiative, she slowly transformed her narrative from one defined solely by a single explosive moment to a more layered portrait of personal growth and systemic critique. While on the network side, producers at The View were forced into introspection as their ratings plummeted among viewers who had grown tired of repetitive, superficial confrontations that now seemed to pale in comparison to the unfiltered honesty of Drew's departure. Internal memos leaked later revealed heated debates about whether the show's format had inadvertently cultivated a culture of manufactured outrage. Several high-profile guests began demanding guarantees that their true voices would not be twisted into mere fodder for sensational highlights, all of which spurred a broader industry conversation about the responsibilities of daytime television to foster meaningful dialogue rather than exploit personal pain for ratings. And even Stephen Colbert, whose show had sparked its own controversies over the years, mentioned in a rare reflective interview that there comes a time when you must ask yourself if the cost of being entertaining is worth sacrificing authenticity, a sentiment that resonated with many who recalled Drew's stance that night. As the months wore on, Drew's digital series gained traction on streaming platforms and social media, and what began as a crisis moment evolved into a movement, a clarion call for artists, activists, and everyday people to reclaim their narratives. From a media machine that had long thrived on conflict and shallow,